The door swung open, and the bell above it jingled, an ordinary sound that barely registered with the staff, who were too busy to notice the newcomer. But this man, he was different. He entered quietly, his presence barely making a ripple in the noisy showroom. Keanu Reeves stood at the threshold, taking a moment to absorb the dealership. He was dressed simply, a plain leather jacket and worn jeans, but there was an air about him, an understated confidence that was hard to ignore. He wasn't here for the noise. He wasn't here for the buzz or the chaos of flashing lights and busy salespeople. No, he was just observing. Want to know what happens next? How this quiet stranger completely changes the game? Stay tuned and subscribe to find out what surprises await in this unexpected journey. Behind the counter stood Frank, a middle-aged salesman with a stocky build and a friendly demeanor. He had been working at the dealership for years, effortlessly guiding customers through the showroom with a big smile and a well-practiced pitch. His charm was his greatest asset, and he used it to close deal after deal, convincing buyers that each bike was the perfect match for them. When he glanced up from his paperwork and saw Keanu standing there, Frank gave a polite nod. "Can I help you, sir?" he asked, trying to gauge if the man was a serious buyer or just another window shopper. He hadn't seen a customer like him in a while, quiet, almost brooding. Not the usual type who came through these doors. Keanu didn't respond right away, just took another moment to glance around at the bikes lined up before him. His expression was calm, unreadable, and Frank found it a bit unsettling. It wasn't often that customers didn't rush to speak, especially in such a fast-paced environment. Frank cleared his throat and tried again. "Looking for something specific?" he asked, putting on his best sales face. Keanu finally looked at him, but his gaze was distant, almost lost in thought. He nodded slightly, the faintest hint of a smile playing at the corner of his lips, though it was impossible to read the emotion behind it. Frank couldn't help but feel a sense of curiosity rise in him. This guy was different, and Frank liked to think he could spot a serious buyer from a mile away. He knew this was his chance to make a sale. "We've got a great selection of bikes here, everything from cruisers to sport models. What are you into?" he asked, trying to break the ice. Keanu tilted his head slightly, his eyes scanning the bikes around him without giving much away. "Just looking," he replied softly. It was the calmness of his words, the way he seemed so composed, that made Frank pause for a moment. Most customers came in with a purpose, asking questions, pointing to their favourites, but not this one. He was content with just observing, and that intrigued Frank more than he cared to admit. Frank chuckled, trying to shake off the tension in the air. "Alright, well, if you change your mind, just let me know," he said, leaning back against the counter. Keanu simply nodded again, his focus drifting back to the rows of gleaming bikes in front of him. It was clear to Frank that the quiet stranger wasn't here for the usual sales pitch, but little did he know, the moment Keanu stepped into the dealership, everything was about to change. The door opened again, and the soft chime of the bell echoed through the dealership. Frank glanced up from his desk, expecting the usual flow of customers, newbies, weekend riders, maybe a few diehards looking for something fast. But then, his eyes landed on the man who had just walked in. It was Keanu Reeves. He didn't immediately stand out at first. In fact, Frank almost dismissed him, thinking he was just another quiet guy trying to get a feel for the bikes. But there was something about the way Keanu moved, the way he took in everything around him with a slow, measured gaze that made Frank pause. The usual customers would rush in, ask about prices, make small talk about their riding preferences. But this guy, he simply stood there for a moment, observing, not hurried, not distracted by anything, just present. Keanu's demeanor was a stark contrast to the usual bustle of the dealership. Frank had dealt with countless customers over the years, people in a rush, people eager to chat, people who were only there for the next best thing. But Keanu wasn't like them. There was an air of mystery about him, something quiet yet intense. His dark leather jacket and worn jeans gave him a rugged look, but it wasn't just his appearance that intrigued Frank. It was the way he carried himself, calm, collected, as if he had all the time in the world, yet didn't need to speak a word to make his presence known. Frank studied him for a moment longer, but then shrugged. It wasn't unusual for someone to come in and just look around. Maybe Keanu was just one of those guys who liked to take his time before making any decisions. Frank was used to that. Keanu seemed to scan the bikes before him, his fingers lightly grazing the handlebars of a few models, but he didn't speak, didn't show any eagerness. Frank could feel the silence stretching between them, but he didn't know what to make of it. Was this guy serious about buying, or was he just a looker? "Can I help you with anything?" Frank finally called out, his voice friendly, but tinged with a hint of impatience. He'd seen too many customers wander in without making up their minds, and he wasn't in the mood to waste time. Keanu turned to face him. The smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth was barely noticeable, and yet it was enough to make Frank pause. It wasn't a smile of excitement or eagerness, but something more contemplative. "I'm just looking," Keanu replied, his voice soft but steady. His eyes met Frank's briefly, then returned to the bikes in front of him. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Just looking?" That was strange. Most people didn't just look at bikes without saying anything else. They asked questions, pointed to specific models, or even tried out the bikes. But Keanu just observed. "All right," Frank muttered, already mentally preparing himself for a long, quiet visit. It wasn't unusual for customers to come in and linger, but they always engaged sooner or later. Not this guy. Frank felt a flicker of suspicion, but then shook it off. Maybe Keanu was the kind of guy who needed some space, someone who didn't like to talk until he was ready. Frank turned back to his computer, keeping an eye on the man from the corner of his eye. Something about Keanu's calm, collected nature seemed to stick out, even in a busy place like this. Frank was used to dealing with all kinds of people, but there was something different about this one. And then, almost as if sensing Frank's thoughts, Keanu's gaze flicked back to him, making Frank snap his attention back to the present. He couldn't quite place it. What was it about this man that felt off? Not in a bad way, but just unusual. It wasn't like Keanu was doing anything wrong. He wasn't being rude, but the silence that surrounded him felt heavy, almost purposeful. And Frank couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here. "Need anything?" Frank repeated, though it felt more like a formality now. "We've got a great selection today." Keanu nodded ever so slightly but didn't answer. He seemed content to stay in the corner, taking his time, letting the world around him swirl in motion while he remained still. Was he here to buy a bike? Or was something else going on? The dealership was a well-oiled machine. Frank, with his easygoing nature and sharp sales skills, had become the heart of the place. He was always chatting with customers, offering advice and closing deals. The assistant manager, Julia, was a woman of efficiency, her sharp mind and no-nonsense attitude ensuring that everything ran smoothly behind the scenes. But today, the dealership was quieter than usual. Keanu had been standing by the bikes for what seemed like hours, barely moving, his eyes always scanning but never focusing on a single thing for too long. Julia was busy, her head buried in the stack of paperwork she needed to finish before the end of the day. She glanced up briefly and noticed Keanu standing in the corner, still as silent as ever. She rolled her eyes. "Another looker, huh?" she muttered under her breath, more to herself than anyone else. Frank, overhearing her, smiled. "Yeah, seems like it. Doesn't look like he's in a hurry, probably just checking out some bikes." "Figures. We've had a bunch of those lately," Julia said, turning back to her work. "Let's hope he buys something, or he'll just be another time waster." Frank gave a light chuckle. "Maybe, but you know the drill. Some people take longer to decide than others." He started walking toward Keanu. Julia didn't seem too interested in the man, but Frank, ever the salesman, figured it was worth a shot. Keanu hadn't even looked at a price tag yet, and that piqued Frank's curiosity. If Keanu wasn't asking questions, maybe he needed a little push. When Frank reached Keanu, he leaned against a nearby bike and smiled. "So, what do you think?" he asked, gesturing to the row of bikes. "We've got some nice ones today, especially this model here." He motioned toward the gleaming sport bike that Frank knew was one of the shop's best sellers. Keanu's gaze shifted from the bikes to Frank. He gave a small nod. "It's nice," he said softly. Frank smiled, but the silence that followed made him uncomfortable. Was the guy interested, or was he just going to stand there all day? "Well," Frank continued, trying to keep his sales pitch going, "this one's a real beauty. Fast, sleek, and perfect for a rider who likes a little thrill." He gave the bike a quick tap, trying to show its value. "You into performance bikes, or are you more into cruisers?" Keanu tilted his head slightly. "I'm not sure yet," he said. Frank paused. Something didn't feel right. This was too much like every other interaction with a quiet guy who probably wasn't going to buy anything. Frank could tell right away that Keanu wasn't giving him anything to work with. The silence was stretching, making Frank feel like he had to fill the gaps. But was this guy serious, or was he wasting Frank's time? "Yeah, I get it," Frank said, trying to lighten the mood. "You probably just want to look around first, right? See what catches your eye?" Keanu didn't respond immediately. He just kept his focus on the bikes, his eyes scanning them again, and Frank could feel his impatience creeping in. "You know, if you want something with more comfort, we've got cruisers too. I could show you a few of those. They're not as fast, but they're great for long rides." Keanu nodded slightly, but still said nothing. Frank, in his growing frustration, pressed on. "I mean, it's a good idea to start with something comfortable, especially if you're new to the whole biking thing. Don't want to get in over your head with something too fast, you know." He immediately regretted it as the words left his mouth. It sounded like he was talking down to the man, assuming he didn't know what he was doing. But Keanu's face remained unreadable. He simply gave a small smile, faint but sincere, and replied, "I know." Frank blinked, taken aback by the calmness of his response. There was something almost knowing about the way Keanu spoke. Something that made Frank feel like the tables had been turned. But Frank, ever the salesman, just smiled and nodded. "All right, well, let me know if you need anything. I'll be around." Keanu gave a slight nod and turned his attention back to the bikes. Frank walked away, scratching his head. Something about this guy just didn't add up. The dealership hummed with the usual rhythm of a Saturday morning. Frank was busy answering a customer's questions about a bike, his usual charm and banter flowing smoothly. He'd done this hundreds of times. Explain the features of a motorcycle, offer a little guidance, and try to seal the deal. "Trust me, this model's perfect for someone who wants to stand out," Frank was saying, pointing to a sleek black sports bike. "It's fast, powerful, and it'll make heads turn every time you ride it." The customer, a young man with wide eyes and eager energy, seemed to take Frank's word for it, nodding enthusiastically. Frank was already mentally counting the commission. Meanwhile, Keanu remained in the background, just as he had been for the past couple of hours. His eyes were still scanning the bikes, his posture unchanged. Every now and then, he would quietly observe the staff interacting with customers, but he remained silent, never once interrupting or engaging. It was as if he was invisible. No one paid him much attention, aside from occasional curious glances. In the midst of this, Julia was busy in her office, furiously typing away at her computer. She was the kind of person who liked to keep things organized, never letting anything slip through the cracks. But she couldn't ignore the nagging thought at the back of her mind. The guy standing there not saying a word. He'd been there for hours, yet hadn't shown any real interest in buying anything. Was he really just a looker? Or was there something more to him? "Hey Frank," Julia called out, poking her head out of her office. "That guy over there, he ever say anything?" She nodded toward Keanu, who was still lingering by the bikes, his hands gently brushing against a few handles. Frank glanced over his shoulder at Keanu but shrugged. "Nah, he's been here for a while. Doesn't say much, but he's not a bother. Probably just checking things out." Julia raised an eyebrow. Well, If he's going to waste our time, I hope he's at least serious about buying something." Frank chuckled. "Yeah, don't we all? But, some people just like to take their time." As the day wore on, the dealership's energy remained the same, constant, with customers coming and going. There were the usual inquiries about bike specs, the excited chatter about first-time purchases, and the dramatic negotiations over prices. But through it all, Keanu remained a silent observer, not reacting to any of the commotion. At one point, Frank overheard a conversation between two young customers who were looking at a cruiser bike. "I don't know, man," one of them said, eyeing the bike. "It's kinda expensive, but if I don't get something now, my girlfriend's gonna kill me." Frank couldn't help but smile at the familiar desperation in the customer's voice. "I hear you, buddy. That's why we're here to help. Let's work out a deal that'll make you both happy." Keanu, standing a few feet away, looked up at the exchange. He wasn't involved in the conversation, but something about the moment caught his attention. The casual way the customers were willing to spend money on something they hadn't really researched made him raise an eyebrow. Maybe it was the type of consumerism that bothered him, or maybe it was just that he knew how easily people could be swayed. He didn't say anything, of course. He simply watched, as quiet and composed as ever. But in his stillness, it was almost as if he saw something that the others didn't, the way the world was moving, so fast and without hesitation. It happened just after lunch, when the showroom was a little quieter, and Frank had just finished dealing with a family interested in purchasing a new dirt bike. Frank was ready for a break. He wiped his hands on his pants and headed back toward the counter, just when a phone call came through. "Frank," Julia called from the office, "you're going to want to take this." Frank raised an eyebrow. He didn't usually take calls, but Julia's tone had a hint of urgency to it. She looked at him with a strange expression on her face. "It's the boss." "The boss?" Frank frowned. "What do you mean, the boss?" Julia just pointed at the phone, shaking her head. Frank shrugged and grabbed the phone. "Hello?" "Frank, it's Keanu," a voice said on the other end. Frank froze. The voice was calm, composed, but there was something in it, a familiarity that made Frank's stomach drop. He looked over at Keanu, who was still standing near the bikes, watching. His face was expressionless, but now, Frank felt the weight of the silence. "Keanu? What's—" Frank stuttered, completely confused. "I need to speak with you," Keanu replied, his voice steady. "I'm about to make a few changes around here." Frank felt his heart rate pick up, but before he could ask anything else, Keanu hung up. Frank stared at the phone in his hand, a strange knot forming in his chest. He felt his blood run cold as the realization slowly sank in. Keanu, the quiet stranger who had been watching everything without saying a word, he wasn't just a regular customer. Frank walked over to Keanu, still unsure of what was happening. Keanu didn't meet his eyes but stood calmly as Frank approached. "Keanu?" Frank asked, his voice uncertain. Keanu finally looked up, a faint smile forming on his lips. "You didn't know, did you, Frank?" Frank blinked, his mind racing. "What do you mean?" Keanu chuckled softly, a sound that was both gentle and knowing. "I'm the owner of this dealership." Frank's mouth went dry. He felt his face flush with heat. "Wait, what? You're the owner. Why didn't you—" Keanu raised his hand, cutting him off. "I wanted to see how things were running before I made any decisions. See how the staff treated customers, how the place operated, how you operated." The weight of Keanu's words hit Frank like a ton of bricks. His mind raced, and he felt a flush of embarrassment creeping up his neck. All the moments he'd dismissed Keanu, all the times he'd assumed he was just another quiet guy who didn't belong, all of it suddenly seemed so foolish. "I didn't know," Frank muttered, looking down at the floor. "I didn't know it was you." Keanu smiled, his expression calm but sincere. "I understand. Most people wouldn't. But I do appreciate your honesty, Frank. You didn't pretend to be something you're not. That's something I value." Frank swallowed, trying to process it all. He had spent the day dismissing the one person who had been watching everything with a keen eye. And now, the truth was out. Keanu wasn't just a quiet customer. He was the one who held the keys to everything. Julia came rushing out of her office at the sound of their conversation, her face going pale as she realized what was happening. "Wait, you're..." she began, but her words trailed off in disbelief. Keanu simply nodded. "Yes, I'm the owner." The room fell silent. Frank and Julia exchanged a look, a mixture of shock, embarrassment and uncertainty. Keanu, on the other hand, remained composed, a quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself. "Don't worry," Keanu said with a faint smile. "There's no need for apologies. I wanted to see how you handled things, and I must say, Frank, you have a knack for reading people." Frank let out a nervous laugh. "I guess I read you wrong, huh?" Keanu nodded slightly. "We all make mistakes. The key is learning from them." And with that, the weight lifted. Frank and Julia stood there, still trying to process the information, but something inside them had shifted. Keanu had watched them all along, quietly judging, not from a position of arrogance, but from a place of understanding. The quiet stranger wasn't just a customer, he was the man who would change everything. The quiet hum of the dealership seemed almost surreal now, as Frank stood in the corner, still trying to make sense of everything that had just transpired. The sudden revelation about Keanu had left him reeling, and there was something about the way Keanu stood there, so composed, so aware, that made Frank feel like he was in the presence of someone who had been watching the world far longer than anyone realized. Keanu leaned casually against one of the bikes, his arms crossed in a way that suggested both relaxation and quiet authority. Frank had been so sure that Keanu was just another customer, a loner with a quiet demeanor, but now it was clear. This man, this quiet, unassuming stranger, was the key to everything. "I know this probably came as a surprise," Keanu said, breaking the silence between them. His voice was calm, but there was a knowing edge to it. "But I've been watching the dealership for a while." Frank blinked, his mind still trying to process the weight of Keanu's words. "Watching? How long?" "A few months now," Keanu replied, not missing a beat. "I wanted to see how things ran without anyone knowing who I really was. I wanted to observe how people behaved, how they treated customers, how you treated them." Frank swallowed hard. He thought back to all those moments when he'd assumed Keanu was just some random guy off the street, the way he had brushed him off when he didn't immediately engage with the sales pitch. Keanu's quiet observation had now turned into a lesson he would never forget. I didn't realize," Frank muttered. Keanu gave a small knowing smile. "Most people wouldn't. You assumed I didn't have the knowledge or the intention to buy, but in reality, I've been in the business long enough to know exactly what works and what doesn't." Frank took a step closer, his curiosity now piqued. "So, what does this mean for the dealership? You've been watching us. What's next?" Keanu's expression softened. "Well, I've learned a lot, and honestly, the dealership is doing well. But there are always things that can be improved. I want to help guide the staff to be more customer-focused, more intuitive, and I think you, Frank, you have the potential to lead the team in a way that's more aligned with that vision." Frank nodded slowly. He was starting to understand now. Keanu wasn't just some rich guy dropping by to buy a bike. He had a deep connection to this place, perhaps even a history that tied him to the world of motorcycles. He wasn't just an observer, he was a mentor, a guide for how things could be done better. "I appreciate you taking the time to show me that," Frank said, feeling both humbled and motivated. "I've learned a lot more in the last few minutes than I have in a long time." Keanu gave him a quick nod. "That's the point. It's easy to make judgments based on first impressions, but we never truly know the whole story until we take the time to understand. I want to build a dealership where that understanding is the foundation, where we don't assume but listen and truly help our customers." Frank smiled. For the first time that day, everything seemed to fall into place. As the day wound down, Keanu stood by the door, the faintest hint of a smile still on his face. Frank had just finished explaining some of the improvements he had in mind, and for the first time in a while, He felt excited about the future of the dealership. There was a new energy in the air, one that had come from the unexpected, the unspoken, and the profound lessons they'd learned in the last few hours. Keanu's presence had changed everything. What had started as a quiet observation had turned into a moment of reflection for everyone. The staff had learned the value of humility, the importance of not judging others based on first impressions, and how much deeper the world could be if they simply took the time to understand it. "So, what's next for you, Keanu?" Frank asked, as they stood together near the door. Keanu smiled, his eyes twinkling with something both knowing and kind. "I'll keep doing what I do, watching, learning, and making sure that this dealership becomes the best version of itself. But for now, just remember, it's not always the loudest voices that carry the most weight." Frank chuckled softly. "Yeah, you've definitely proven that." Keanu gave a final glance toward the bikes, his expression thoughtful. "Sometimes the quietest ones have the most to say. You just have to listen carefully." With that, he turned and walked out, leaving Frank standing in the doorway. Frank watched him disappear into the distance, his mind still processing everything. What started as a regular day at the dealership had turned into something profound, a lesson in humility, understanding, and patience. As Keanu's figure faded into the background, Frank smiled to himself. He wasn't just the quiet stranger anymore. Keanu had become something much more, someone who had silently guided the dealership into a new light. And Frank knew with certainty that he would never look at another customer the same way again. If you've enjoyed this story and the twist that unfolded, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on more surprising moments like this.